huge deal for me to get to be here. This is actually, I think, the biggest placemaking conference that we've heard about. And this is an amazing time for this. So thanks to the Institute for Quality Communities for putting this together. And thanks for bringing together many of my idols and the people I've been learning from for so long. Indeed, as Christopher Lineberger said, placemaking takes many different skills, and it's much more complex than any of us realize. And so many of the different skills and the thought leaders are represented by many of the speakers today. And we've certainly been learning a great deal from all of them over the years. But we also want to say that placemaking is about really recentering the power of shaping your communities in communities, and then drawing from the best of all these different disciplines and skills. So I'm going to talk about how, and this idea of place management is a big way to do that. But how do we really reinvent the way we participate in our communities and reinvent the way government works around place management as a potential focus? But this idea of when we focus on places, we do everything differently. And in many ways, it's wonderful that we're here in the center of our community and in the center of our country, and in a state very much represented by strong rural communities. And we find that really placemaking is going back to sort of the common sense approach through which our communities were first created. And I really, when I think of great places and great placemaking infrastructure in terms of how communities build themselves, I think of the smallest rural communities, the small main streets in this country, that really is what we need to move back to in many ways. And what we've gotten away from. And we're now working around the world, and unfortunately, the rest of the world is copying the many of the big mistakes that we've talked about around suburbia, not the great, strong civic infrastructure around community-based planning that rural communities have exemplified in this country in many ways, but we're losing too. So, our work was really started by a man by the name of William HWhite, who some of you may have heard of. He was one of the first people to really be critical of sort of the segregation of communities in suburban areas in 1956 in a book called The Organization Man. Identified the problem of sprawl in the late 50s and the effect on rural landscapes in the 60s. Actually was editor of Fortune magazine and got Jane Jacobs to write her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, started as an article in Fortune magazine. But increasingly his career looked at the center of cities and at the human scale, and really discovered how, in fact, we're forgetting to design the centers of our communities for people, for human interaction, for comfort. And how when we get that right, a lot of other things fall into place. So our work was really set up to fix failed public spaces and to get some very common sense principles of human comfort and interaction integrated into how we plan our cities. Now, of course, that's turned us on this larger journey of how when you focus on place, you do everything differently, and how it changes the way we all participate in the creation of our communities. And now we're seeing it as a major agenda for economic development, for governance, for social integration, inequality, for addressing inequality and those sorts of issues. And so we're seeing this great convergence around the idea of place, and this conference is one of the great representations of that convergence. And we've been partnered with many of the different movements and explored how a focus on place can enhance and draw out the potential impact of those movements, but bring in new partners as well. So new urbanism has been an amazing one that is this great foundation of knowledge and expertise to be built on. I was just at a conference 2 weeks ago in Sweden looking at how placemaking can help broaden and enhance what new urbanism has built, the conversation they've built. Same with the Trust for National Historic Preservation, how in many ways the Main Street organizations are the best place managers, the best placemakers in this country. But how do we build on that to really think about how we reshape our land use, our economic development models, and how do we focus on place a little more holistically? So we're focusing on the uses in a space, not just preserving the form, but the best way to preserve the form is also to preserve the uses and to create new uses. And you look at historic main streets, and they were defined by their activity, not just by their form. The form is beautiful, but that alone doesn't obviously make a great place. So each of these movements we're partnering with in various ways. We've worked in all 50 U.S. states We actually now run something called the Citizens Institute on Rural Design that's housed by the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with the USDA. It's one of it's a very, very small program, but it's to help sort of coalesce this discussion on how a lot of these different tools being discussed today can be applied to rural communities. There's an online resource center and a series of workshops that we run around the country. But we've worked in 43 countries now internationally with increasingly now with UN Habitat. And increasingly we really see ourselves as a network of organizations like the Institute for Quality Communities that are exploring placemaking and how we can highlight each other, draw out best practices, and each part of the world is sort of innovating in some way and sort of limited in another way. So we kind of push those all along. And share that increasingly through social media and in our online outlets. But these are some of the areas that we are active, that we have active partnerships in to support placemaking in some ways, that have great stories to tell about placemaking. Texas actually has been a big area that's been innovating in a lot of ways. In Michigan, we're hosting a conference next week in Detroit, really launching something called the Placemaking Leadership Council. 200 people are coming together from all over the world to show how, to look at how Detroit and Michigan is taking on placemaking as their chief economic development strategy now, really building around local assets through what we call lighter, quicker, cheaper implementation, low-cost approaches to planning. And I'll show you some of what we're doing there. But we like to start with these slides. We say that we shape our public spaces, thereafter our public spaces shape us. Winston Churchill said, of course, said the same about buildings. And then we say that between the traffic engineer and the architect here in Houston, they created an almost pedestrian-free environment. Yet we go to places like this on vacation. We're still creating places like this in our downtowns. And we don't realize the extent to which we're shaped by by our communities, how we feel about ourselves, how we connect to each other and to the places we're in by our built environment. And Jane Jacobs, of course, said that lowly, unpurposeful, and random as they may appear, sidewalk contacts are the small change from which a city's wealth of public life may grow. But no one's really focused on creating places where people are comfortable, where they actually have an excuse to feel justified talking to each other in stationary activity. And effectively, we've designed out this type of gathering out of many of our downtowns. These people would be considered loiterers, wouldn't be smiling if they were next to one of those columns. And, but in a sense, we think if we plan our cities to create these types of opportunities where people want to gather and connect on their main street, on a street corner, that a lot of the other goals that we have in our community actually fall into place. Of course, William HWhite said that it's hard to create a space that will not attract people. What's remarkable is how often this has been accomplished. And unfortunately, we see many of the award-winning designs of new public spaces really limiting the public outcomes. And through our sort of design-led approaches, we're not seeing we're not seeing the potential of public spaces realized to the extent we need it. This is Boston City Hall Plaza. This picture is taken 35 years ago. It was meant to copy the form of Piazza del Campo in Siena. But of course, despite many efforts by Harvard Graduate School of Design architects to retrofit it, they haven't fixed it. And it's because it's not really about design. It's what makes these spaces work is much more about the management, the process through which they're created, their integration into their context. And it actually makes design more important when you lead with place and place management, and it draws out the creativity of architects. We need much more architecture. We need much more demand for architecture and their creativity, but we actually think architects are kind of strangling the potential creativity of good places by feeling like they need to lead, and they're told they have to lead. That's how we've defined it. We have to lead with place and having the community define those, and we've developed tools and processes to allow that to happen in a structured, facilitated way. Perhaps most importantly, what attracts people most, it would appear, is other people. We forget the basic idea that we want places that people want to go. And this is a church, a Catholic church in Arvada, Colorado, in a downtown, surrounded by parking. And we were working there, and they said that they wanted to take out these two homes to expand their parking lot and better fulfill their mission. We were thinking of this church in Mexico City, in the Coyoacan neighborhood, where they've actually removed on-street parking. There's no parking that's easy for 10 blocks. There's actually no transit there. It's really hard to get there, but it's such a great destination that people want to be there. So we forget that the point of transportation planning is actually to get people to places they want to be. We need to create great destinations that people actually want to be in. The best public spaces, the best downtowns in the world have huge parking problems. You're not a good place unless you have a parking problem. So if you plan for cars and traffic, you get cars and traffic. You get what you plan for. If you plan for development, you get development. If you plan for design, you get design. We need to broaden the potential outcomes we're trying to achieve. This is the experience you get when you go to many downtowns, and you're not likely to come downtown again. You're going to go to the mall next time because it's a really insulting, dehumanizing experience to have to cross a street like this and hold on to your friends to get across it. So to truly change the paradigm, we have to start planning for people and places. And it's a larger paradigm shift that I think we realize, which I'll keep talking about. We led a campaign in New York City called the Streets Renaissance Campaign, was to move the conversation away from cars versus bikes versus pedestrians to saying, how do we create great streets that we all want to be on? How do we create great streets that draw out and showcase the vitality of our communities? Did several demonstration projects around the city, including working with the Times Square Alliance to envision how their public spaces could be stronger. And they actually, part of our goal was to get the old DOT commissioner fired and bring in a new one. And the new one came in and she quickly implemented most of these demonstration projects that the community had been asking for a long time. But the most visible one was in Times Square, where they didn't have the seating ready, so they went to a nearby hardware store and bought $35 lounge chairs and put them out in the center of Broadway. And this just really blew people's minds on how public space can change and how on the level of comfort that can be accommodated in the space. And and had plenty of arguments about the style and aesthetic of the seat of the amenities, but that just allowed it to be even more comfortable and accessible to people. So what makes a good place? We used to do a ton of data collection of analysis from William HWhite, both us and Jan Gale sort of do a lot of the same data collection that William HWhite pioneered. But increasingly we've developed tools to allow communities to evaluate spaces themselves and come up with actually a lot more efficiently really valuable data about how a space is working and how it's limited, how it can be improved. And these are some of the basic criteria. We ask people, are there reasons to be in this space? Are there uses and activities? Again, we like to quickly look at aesthetics in a space, but we think we need to really frame the conversation around uses and what you do in the space to have a more constructive conversation. Around access and linkages, is it connected, walkable? Can you get there? Is it comfortable? Does it have a strong identity, a local historic identity? Is it reflect sort of local personality? And then sociability. Are there people in groups, women, children, elderly? Is there stationary activity in the space? And so we think when you structure that conversation and have people evaluate their public spaces around place, that it actually changes everything. And it changes the way people listen to each other. It changes the way they start to work together. And they all start to have a shared responsibility for improving that place. And they can't just sort of blame it on others or expect the experts to come in and fix it. And so you think when you focus on place, that it's actually a more fundamental way of accomplishing many of the other goals we have in our communities, from diversity issues to economic issues, that strong places actually make local economies viable. And a focus on place makes local retail viable and allows this attachment to occur. Increasingly, people are talking about this idea of place attachment as one of the biggest crises. How do you keep young people to want to stay here? How do you get tourists to want to feel connected to this place and that they'll come back to it, that they'll spend longer? There's a recent study done by the Knight Foundation called The Soul of the Community. It looked into what leads people to feel attached to their community. They thought it was going to be things like level of jobs, economic development, quality of schools, those sorts of things in healthcare, but there's actually no correlation between those qualities and attachment. There was a very high correlation between aesthetics, but aesthetics alone didn't lead to attachment. Aesthetics, opportunities for social engagement, and cultural openness. And in many ways, those are the same qualities that we find make a good place. So they've actually since come to placemaking. People that did the study had never heard of placemaking, but come to placemaking is the means to create attachment. And they found that when there's greater attachment to your community, that there's actually greater economic growth, greater entrepreneurship, and obviously greater connection and commitment to being in that community. So entrepreneurs are more likely to invest in the long term in a way that really contributes back to that community. So the way we frame this conversation around place and placemaking is something called the power of 10, and I think this actually correlates nicely with what Christopher Leinberger was saying with the need for 7 to 8 walkable destinations for a city with a population of 1 million. And so we would say perhaps, we'd push that even further. Let's say 10. Let's drive, the vision for what's possible, and say a great, so you need 10 great destinations for Oklahoma City, but then to define that at different levels, each destination or district needs 10 places in it, and then each place needs 10 things to do in it. So it actually makes it less overwhelming. That really, we think cities are defined in our experience at this place scale and around what we do in those spaces. And so we ask people, we often do this digitally using sort of online tools, what are their favorite places, the least favorite places, the opportunity places, and what else could be done to improve it, and you get a lot of really good information. We think communities are really good at saying what they do there and what they'd like to be able to do there. We don't ask them to do the master planning or to do design so much as what they'd like to do there, and you can develop a really robust program, a vision for a public space, a district, a region, through this approach that really is supportive of what the disciplines can then add to that space. So we did this assessment actually in Vancouver, Canada, a long time ago with the planning department, and they're so well known for creating great density and ecological dimensions of urbanism and green swaths. But we did exercises, and there were very few green dots of good places on the map. And the planning director said, "Oh my God, we planned the fun out of the city. We'd been doing everything at this other scale, but forgetting about good places." And he said that placemaking provides the link between urban excellence, economic development, sustainability, and public health. And they've since been taking that on in a bolder way. So, but what is placemaking? And we're learning it's a broader than we realized every day. These were some of the definitions. We asked our membership lists to tell us what their definitions are. These are some of the ones we really enjoyed. That placemaking is turning a neighborhood, town, or city from a place you can't wait to get through to one you never want to leave. It's the creation of a built environment that creates community, stimulates interaction, encourages entrepreneurship, fosters innovation, nurtures humanity. It's creating for everybody. It's the seed of democracy. It's the process of giving a space a story that's shared by many. But we see placemaking now as a much larger potential movement. In that my father, who actually founded Project for Public Spaces in 1975, he was one of the founders of Earth Day in 1970, founded it in New York City. And so a lot of his friends and people I grew up around are a lot of the founders of the environmental movement. But the environmental movement in many ways sort of forgot to look at cities and human activity at the center of communities. And we see placemaking as a way to reinvent and broaden what the environmental movement can accomplish. But it's really, the environmental crisis to us is really represented by this statistic that Richard Louv did, who wrote The Last Child in the Woods, talked about nature deficit disorder, those sorts of things. He said that a study of 3 generations of 9-year-olds found that over a recent 20-year period, the radius around the home that children were allowed to play had sunken almost 90%. So children growing up today are having a very different, a much more limited experience of their public realm, of their community than they were 20 years ago. And it's true in every part of the world. And that to us is, and we see placemaking as the means through nibbling away at that. And how do we challenge and empower people to start to see the world beyond their home as something that they do shape, that they can shape, that whether they like it or not, they are shaping, essentially, through their interaction or through their participation in that community. But so the crisis, though, is really the process through which we create places. And it's done mostly through what we call a project-driven, discipline-driven approach. And we used to criticize traffic engineers all the time, and we still do. We used to say whatever a traffic engineer says, do the opposite, and you'll be building your community. until about 10 years ago, a traffic engineer, someone that was the head of planning and script development at New Jersey DOT said, well, what would the opposite be? And so we had to figure that out. And he had us train all the traffic engineers in the state of New Jersey in placemaking. And this is the process through which most planning is done, the NEPA process that requires public input, requires making your project have less of a negative impact on the community or on the environment. But we reinvented that process through this, what we call the place or community-driven approach that starts with defining the place and the stakeholders using this Power 10 initiative, then, or the tool that has people evaluate a place using this place evaluation game and developing a vision. And it changes the role of the experts and the stakeholders, and then the types of solutions are more short-term, lighter, quicker, cheaper, or tactical urbanism approaches. And then long-term experiments, you're always evolving it, but through this process, you're building the capacity of a community to manage itself. You're building its place management or place governance capacity, and for people to all learn from each other, make mistakes, and continually build the space. You're not just relying on an outside expert to come and fix it and do it. You can draw on on outside experts, but it's the power and responsibility is more centered in the community. We've done a lot of work in the Netherlands, and we said, well, why do you need us? They're really great at design. They have some of the best public spaces. But with actually the transportation agencies, they drew this diagram saying that, well, traditional planning, we're still doing it like this. We're still doing process, design, then use. Placemaking is really much more iterative. It's looking at use, learning from that to design to support use through an ongoing engagement process around place management. So one quick example project is in Detroit. We, about 10 years ago, did a vision for the center of their city for something called Campus Martius. This was sort of the ground zero of Detroit, their Soldiers and Sailors Monument. This vision and the process to create it attracted the $20 million that was needed to implement it. They did an international design competition, but none of the big-name designers were really building something that was about reflecting that vision, so they went with a more local or regional landscape architect. This is what it was built, and it immediately, the vision and then since it was built, attracted investment and development in the adjacent blocks, and now it's in the billions of dollars. And now just last week, we've announced a whole other plan to take this to the next level, doing 10 different destinations within the downtown, each with many more than 10 places and 10 things to do in it, done mostly through a lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. This is what part of this space looks like now. There's the waterfront. This is Cadillac Square and Campus Martius, and this is the vision that's going to be implemented in the coming years. And this is the vision that's going to be implemented this summer around these different sort of short-term efforts, similar to sort of the better block model that you'll hear from later. That's really one of the most powerful movements in the country. So we're seeing this lighter, quicker, cheaper approach is really transformative to cities and things you can do right away. But I just want to close with this quick slide that we need to keep pushing what the potential is of placemaking. And I've been working a lot in Australia. I was in New Zealand last week, actually looking at how to sort of reinvent the model of a development agency and of government around placemaking. And the city of Adelaide is on track to make it so every department, their goal is to create places, but ultimately is to actually shift the capacity of governance towards communities around this place governance model. And they're using a lot of our tools to reframe that, and they've had us there to do a lot of training. But a lot of planning is still in what we call a project-driven model. It's deliver it quick, fast, as cheap as we can, and and it gets a little better when it becomes discipline-led. We get good experts, we get design quality, and more creativity, more artistry involved. We need to keep building on this. We need to keep the efficiency of the project-driven model, add the creativity and expertise of the discipline model. Place sensitive is even better, become more adaptive to the community, more context sensitive, more about sustainability. We listen more to the community. It's more integrative in those ways. But we need to make sure we keep evolving towards what we call a place-led model, where everyone is competing to contribute to the shared experience, where it's the place that leads, not a set of solutions or sort of one entity. No one use or user group can dominate that process or the ultimate place. And we're all looking for what we call place outcomes, or creating place capital, the shared value of the public realm. So I think we're on that track, and this event is a huge event, sort of I think will represent a step change in this country and around the world as people are following us on Twitter and elsewhere. In this conversation, we need to go back to really the common sense that built the strong American communities that everyone admires and aspires to. But we can also, and then build on the great expertise and experiences that are the inquiry of all the different disciplines is leading in this country as well. So what you all do in Oklahoma will be watched, and we look forward to continuing that conversation with the Institute of Quality Communities. Please connect to us on social media and elsewhere as we lead that conversation going forward. But thank you so much for having me here, and continue.